So I recently picked up a dedicated cinema camera, and with that, I have the learning curve of learning how to use a cinema camera. And the cool thing that I recently learned, which allows me to completely forget about using shutter speed and just stick to this other thing called shutter angle. And what's so cool about shutter angle is it pretty much does the math for you that you'd normally do if you were to use the shutter speed, which is pretty standard across DSLRs when you're shooting video and mirrorless cameras that are also photo dedicated. So anybody who's been shooting video for the mirrorless or DSLRs knows that you use the shutter speed. It needs to be twice your frame rate, and that is to give you the cinematic look. I hate that word, but everybody knows what I'm talking about when I say that. So that means that for half of the existence of the frame, it is being exposed. And that'll give you pretty standard motion blur that you'd expect even when you're just looking normally. So when I look at my hand normally, I see about the same motion blur that I'm now seeing, and the camera's picking up. So from there, it means that you have to do a lot of math when you switch from 25 frame rate to 50 and then 100. You have to do the math, double it. Okay, so 100 needs to be double, so 1/200th, and then if you want more motion blur, then you need to lower that number, and then if it's down to 100, 1/100th, and then if you need it more so that it's more exact and there's less motion blur, then you have to do the math on that as well. But the angle is a lot easier because it stays consistent across frame rates, and it's just plain easier to think about more or less motion blur. So the 180 is pretty much standard cinematic motion blur. And the way that it came to be the angle was back when there's the film cameras and they had a circular shutter, and the angle is describing how much of that circle is no longer there. So it allows light to come through. So 180 is exactly cut down the center, so half of the time that that frame is there, it is being exposed. The other half, the light is being blocked from it. So when you decrease from 180, there's less motion blur. When you increase from 180, there is more motion blur. And that's pretty easy to think about because it'll stay consistent across any frame rate you go to. A real life example of this is when I use the C70, I usually shoot in 25 frames a second. But I have hotkeyed to the number 11 button to shoot at 100 frames a second. If I was using shutter speed, I would have to go back and press the proper shutter speed. But because I have the angle, I'm already going to get that similar cinematic look across all of mine. Yes, there's going to be less motion blur because it's at a higher frame rate, but it's still being exposed half of the time the exact same way that the 25 frames was being exposed, which is pretty cool, saves you time, and I hope this made a lot of sense because it makes a lot of sense to me now. And yeah, if you have any questions, just drop them below and I'll get them answered, I guess. Thank you for watching. I hope this wasn't too long.